So I'd like to introduce to you Yvonne Roberts, who's a journalist writing for The Observer and also already working on her 5th novel. We have Jonathan Rowson, writer, philosopher, and also chess grandmaster, so a very extraordinary combination of disciplines. What I was going to say, 2 formidable players this afternoon. And I'm Indra Adnan, I'm a psychotherapist, and I'm also the co-initiator of The Alternative UK, which is a new political platform which exists just to answer the question, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? So we created our platform in response to Brexit, which was a highly fraught moment when actually emotions became a kind of a dirty word. Because while the main political parties were all putting forward a very coherent and sensible economic argument, somebody else was making the emotional argument and possibly won that. And the emotional argument is, do we want to take back control? Do we want more autonomy in our lives? And across the Atlantic, we had another similar argument. Do we want America to be great again? It was an issue of status. So is something more important being revealed when people choose emotions over economic logic? Is it just that they can be easily triggered? Or is there something about people's needs that are not really being considered enough in politics? Maybe it's not just a tax cut that they're looking for. And for those of you who are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, why don't you let us know how you're...
Let rip. Okay.
Yeah, please.
I'm sort of split in 2 different directions here because in 1912, when women strikers in Massachusetts from a textile factory who'd been on strike for 3 months went on the march, they asked for bread and roses. They didn't just ask for bread, they asked for roses as well. And as far as I can remember, and the many times that I've interviewed people, nobody's ever just said that they are angry about the money. What we're seeing at the minute now is a huge surge of anger because politicians haven't read our nation in a way that they should, partly because they aren't very representative, and partly because there is still a very class-based hierarchical view of who is equipped to do politics and economics and what the rest of us should do. And there's a very good book by a writer called Sylvia Nasser, an American writer, who looks at the personal lives of a number of famous economists, including Keynes and Milton Friedman and so on. And my golly, they're a really neurotic bunch. You wouldn't trust them further than you could throw them. I mean, the idea that economics is itself a science is such a daft idea in the first place. But what they did have was the drive and the ability. When you look now at the kind of state of our society, the last 10 years since 2008, and I'll just run through a couple of obvious facts, but you'll all know it because you've been experiencing it. Wages have flatlined. For the first time, I think capitalism isn't delivering on that promise that if you work hard, your children will do better than you did, where people are now sliding back down the ladder. So when you have a situation where, again, in one of the most affluent countries in the world, you've got child poverty on the rise, you've got the fact that our public purse has been slashed from 60 billion in 2010 to 35 billion, at the same time as the government poured 435 billion into the banks that were the cause of our trouble, of course there's a huge sense of injustice. The difficulty is that with the kind of politics, the Westminster politics we've got, there's no way to express it until it actually erupts. And one of the things that a governing body always is fearful in this country, and again it's a class thing, is the mob, is the expression of any kind of revolt, because unfortunately we're quite a passive, we get to the point like 1926 with the Great Strike, where we will go so far and then we will surrender, basically. And I have a real feeling that this time there is a real change. I think Brexit has been the first time, and I'm a Remainer, but I think Brexit is the first time that the government has been forced to take notice of what the majority want. Does that lead to a different kind of politics? This is why I've said initially I was split in 2 ways. Every 2 years, The Observer runs this thing called 50 New Radicals, and where we look at organizations and individuals who are doing things in a different way. Actually, it's not really a different way. It's just community organization, community action. It's trying to set a different agenda. And it's feeding on the idea that most people, when you look at what makes people happiest, it's the connection they have with others. It's the feeling that you're all pulling together to do something worthwhile. And everywhere we go, when we're looking for these new contenders for radicals, we see so much going on at a community level. Again, paradoxically, it's because the welfare state, sadly, is in tatters. So that's my paradox, that out of the ruins, I hope something much more positive is happening.
So would you say that it's a different kind of intelligence that's required that isn't really being accessible at the political level at the moment? Because when you're contrasting it to the community level, is it a deliberate ignorance, or is it?
I think it's very difficult when you consider the Chancellor, the previous Chancellor of the Exchequer now earns £15,000 a day for just one of his 6 jobs. I mean, that's got to tell you that they're not very plugged into how the majority of people are living. And when there's also a sort of delusional aspect. I think one of the things that strikes me is how with America before and now with Trump, it always talks about positivity, the power of positivity. The individualism is what matters, that individuals, just as long as they think the right thought, can go far. So it's sort of disconnected from the fact that we all need to be part of a welfare state that's positive. And you think that the US, where they have this positivity and individualism, consumes 2/3 of the global market in antidepressants. So there's a sort of capacity to be deluded, which I think is actually also the case at Westminster. They just can't read their own population anymore.
Right. So, Jonathan, is it all doom and gloom, or do you see that this is like a moment in time, or could something develop from here?
Yeah, it's all doom and gloom. We should forget about it and go home. No, I think you've got to find the right kind of hope. I think the hope that goes beyond the sort of facile positivity that Yvonne was alluding to, and look more deeply at what would it actually mean to find a political program that made sense of where people were, and what their daily lives are like, what they experience, and build from that some kind of vision or programmatic idea of how we live together over the next 10, 20, 100 years. What would that look like? Where do you start from if you're going to do that kind of endeavor? And I think emotions are a good place to start. To make sense of that, I think just to back up slightly, when we're talking about emotions in politics, but if you slightly shift the register to speak about emotions in democracy for a second, in democratic theory, they speak about democracies as 3 main things. It's quite useful sometimes to break this up, because otherwise it's just this big morass, this big concept. There's the kind of source of power, which is the people. So the first level is kind of cultural level. It's the people as such. And then the level above that is kind of the policy, where the agents and the activists kind of operate. That's the world of Whitehall and Westminster and, to some extent, the media. And then you have the sort of orienting goal or vision of society as a whole, which at the moment is principally GDP, gross domestic product, economic growth, although there are challenges to that vision as well. But what you have in democracy is a kind of movement in these 3 realms between the people as a whole, often assumed to be kind of undifferentiated, static, constant, just the people. Just when we hear the will of the people, it's like one thing, one monolithic thing. And clearly that's not the case. Most of the politics happens at this middle layer of, should we raise interest rates a tiny bit or not? What is the right target for climate change? How much inequality is tolerable and so forth. But the bigger problem is, what the hell are we trying to do? Right? What's the overarching purpose of society? And can people feel that at an individual level? So can you get from the kind of emotional, cultural level up through the kind of policy and idea level into the kind of vision and purpose and meaning level? That's the kind of democratic challenge writ large. And why begin with emotions? Because emotions are kind of the front line between you and reality. Emotions are, we can name them as, anger and fear and sadness and so forth. But actually, it's your experience of the world. Emotion, more broadly conceived, is not just about the things that Indra mentioned about status and identity and fear and resentment sometimes that drive political outcomes. It's also just your felt sense of being a human being. That's the kind of emotional foundation that we have for politics. So the challenge for me is, I think politics today is at the middle layer. It thinks everything happens there. It's all about what they're saying in Westminster, what the latest policy program, the latest white paper, and it moves in amongst that register. But I think political hope rests in realizing that the other two are not constants, they're variables. So there's a variable in how human beings develop, and there's a variable in our overarching societal vision and what we're trying to achieve. And if we can shift the register of those two, our programmatic idea of what we should do, who we should vote for, how we organize society becomes clearer. So one way of thinking of that, democracy, of the people, for the people, by the people, right? We hear that a lot. It's often the shorthand definition of what democracy is. If you just add an adjective there and see how it sounds, of the emotional people, for the emotional people, by the emotional people. And then if you push that a little further and say, of the emotions, for the emotions, by the emotions, you start getting a feeling for what's going on. Some kind of morass of reflexes and responses and feelings that are actually driving this thing as a whole and the relationship between these things. So I think the challenge, you can actually have a lot of fun with that, because you can actually start thinking about, if we had an intelligent politics, what would the right adjective be? What kind of people, and what kind of people? Would it be, at the moment, it seems something like, of the emotional people, by the clever people, for the rich people, or something like that. But we can play with that, and there are a million variables you can work with. But for me, the hope lies in recognizing those different things, the overarching vision, the emotional source, and spending more time on those things and a bit less on the technocratic tinkering in the middle.
Can I just I think that's a very good question, but if I could just respond to Jonathan as a feminist. Women are very wary about emotions because for several hundred years we were told we were too emotional, we're too hysterical, we're too over the top, we're too untrustworthy, and I think the word emotion carries so much baggage, quite a lot of it negative, and it suits government to constantly tell us that Brexit was a result of anger. I don't think because anger is seen as a very destructive emotion, and I actually don't think it was a destructive emotion. I think it was based on a lot of, I did a lot of traveling at the time just before the vote, and I could almost sense what was going to happen because people had been thinking about this for a very long time. They'd witnessed the destruction of their communities, they'd witnessed the influx of drugs, they'd witnessed what happens when work is no longer a discipline because there is no work. And as I say this as a feminist, men don't want to be on the till in Tesco. It takes a long time for men to actually feel that as manly a job as being down the pit or in steel. Nobody wants to bring the coal industry back, but we didn't read people's emotions because we assumed that when I say we, I'm talking about Westminster, I'm talking about your middle layer, that we knew better. So I agree absolutely with everything Jonathan is saying, but I'm just wary of the word emotion attached to it unless we define it a bit more. Emotional literacy is brilliant. I mean, when I was at the Young Foundation, I spent 3 years, I didn't even really know very much about emotional literacy or non-cognitive skills. But there is so much evidence out there that the education system we have is breaking the first rule. And the first rule is first do no harm. Our education system, unless you're in private school, where you get £12,000 a year spent on a child in primary school compared to £4,000 in our state schools, and it's not about money, but they do understand at a private school level that non-cognitive skills matter. That actually if you're told that if you work hard enough, you can do better than Einstein, kids actually don't believe that. Carol Dweck, who's a very famous person working in emotional literacy, literally teaches young children who've been told by osmosis by teachers that they're stupid, that they can actually retrain their brain. And the first thing when I was interviewing her a few years back, she said, and she tells us a lot, she says that a young boy who was 11 years of age, who'd basically grown up all through his childhood believing he was stupid, he came to her after he'd heard about what she calls brainology and said, does this mean I'm not really stupid? And she said, yes, it does. And we're actually creating a whole generation now of young people who have it, I hate to say the snowflake generation, but they are used to succeeding. They cannot cope with failure. And the best thing is you learn from failure. You don't learn from success. So emotional literacy, yes. I mean, but emotions, I'm a bit wary of.
Yeah, we sort of have to pull those two things apart. You want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think you alluded to it. You know, the very idea of emotion is emotional, right? That's part of the challenge. To anchor it in a real example, so Brexit, for example, it was an emotional outcome, but what does that actually mean? It doesn't mean that people didn't think about it. It meant that certain forms of experience were evoked by the opportunity to vote decisively, and status was a big part of it. Some anger was part of it, some sadness, loss of certain community identification, identity was part of it, resentment, a certain feeling of the political class being removed and remote, and maybe a certain degree of aspiration and longing too, a certain idea that maybe we can get back control. So this expression that defined the campaign, take back control, I think it was Will Davies, the sociologist, who said that it was ingenious because it connected the psychoanalytic to the macroeconomic. In other words, take back control on the one hand is very, very personal and visceral, but it also refers to the levers of economic policy as well. And that single expression encapsulates the whole arc of that. So I agree. How do you talk about emotions without people assuming that you're somehow, I don't know, you're starting off on the back foot somehow,
Irrational,
right?
yeah.
Right. Questions, anyone and everyone? Yeah. I'll take two at a time, so go ahead. Thank you.
I guess my question was about rationality versus emotion, because we've glorified rationality since the industrialization, and yet we humans are still so much in the subconscious. We make decisions out of subconscious, and that subconscious gets formed 0 to 7. So you get people who react from that 0 to 7 place, no matter what rationality is thrown at them. And so we think people are so rational and they analyze, and but actually they're reacting. So how do we deal in a political atmosphere, and how do we educate, therefore? Because people are just doing it blindly at the moment. We just end up where we end up. So I just am really curious how we address that, and how we then end up ultimately with better politics.
Hello, I'm not very good at forming thoughts, but I'm a teacher and I'm very interested in schools and looking at this. And I think you were saying that children aren't now, young people aren't coming out knowing how to think. And I think also maybe they're not allowed to feel either. So they go through the system and there is no space for disagreement because the curriculum says there is this one answer, and there's no space within it for children to express how they're feeling. But then also I'm interested in democratic education, and that in those spaces as well seems a little bit like sometimes they're just recreating what is our broken system, but in a smaller scale, and allowing children a higher role in that. So I'm not sure what my question is, but just something around thinking.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so role of education maybe, and
I think the question of irrationality, I don't know if you've read any of Cordelia Fine's books, because she's a psychologist and she's done a bit on neuroscience, and they're really a delight to read anyway because they're very funny. But we are so irrational, it's scary. I mean, you show a group a picture of a blonde, busty woman, and they'll start behaving towards other women as if they're all blonde, busty. I mean, even the most reasonable of people, it's amazing how irrational we can be. I think it goes back to emotional literacy and what you teach in class, so it becomes second nature to start to reflexively start thinking. What is it I actually feel? You know, where is the argument here? What can I distinguish extract my emotions from how I'm feeling? I mean, as a kind of 60s feminist, one of the surprising things was when we all sat down and we all started to talk and so on. And that feeling moved from it's my fault, if only I was different, to hang on, there's a systems problem here. So to go back to Jonathan's point, it might be if there was more of the systems point here, we'd find more that we have in common. And in terms of the kind of, the way in which, well, there's a study of 69 teenagers who were incarcerated, psychiatric hospital, put into a psychiatric hospital, and the longitudinal study, it's American, followed them through. And out of that 69, only 7 turned their lives around. And what they found they had in common, those 7, was reflectiveness, which is time to think. So I'm guilty of that. You know, when your teenager disappears into the bedroom for the 7th hour and you think, you know, what are you doing in there? Actually, they need that time. It was relatedness. It was the ability to make relationships that are positive, which doesn't mean exploiting people. It just means choosing the right kind of people to enhance your life. And it was resilience. It was actually saying, okay, that has been tough, but I can bounce back. And I don't think we do any of that really in schools. So maybe you can start.
Jonathan.
So anyone who's done psychotherapy will know that, I say this with a psychotherapist sitting next to me, that there are often moments where the person who's there for some kind of healing or clarity is talking a lot. And they're saying, I think this, I feel that, la, la, la. But they're not actually feeling anything, really. There's often a lack of awareness of what's going on in the body. And then they're often asked to, I'm using the third person here for good reasons, but you'll bear with me and guess what you want to guess. But you're speaking like this, and they're saying, but what do you actually feel? And you kind of resent the question. You know, there's an emotional reaction that says, I don't really want to feel it, I just want to talk about it. So there's a risk there that when we get into the realm of emotion, that, you know, the intellect and the ego are close allies. The intellect will fight hard to protect the ego. But the emotions are often seen by the ego as a kind of enemy sometimes, because they'll actually tell you the truth. And the truth won't always set you free. It will often, you know, cause you trouble. So somehow, becoming more emotionally literate is a huge challenge. It's not here's a list. Schools sometimes do things beautifully, but they can sometimes do things that just cover it. You know, it's about a question of coverage. We've done emotional literacy now, because we've told the class what the emotions are and asked them to identify them. But really feeling it, you know, like it's really hard. Like the emotional work of actually knowing what it is you're feeling at any given minute is a non-trivial achievement. You know, it's something to aspire for and work towards.
Yeah, and I do teach emotional literacy a little bit to teenagers, in fact, and helping teenagers to respect their own emotions is very important too, because they are essentially messengers, you know, from the body, that something is not being met here. And we do have emotional needs, which are neurologically proven to be there for our survival. So this learning that does have to happen, ideally, when you're a teenager, is something that most of us grew up without. And so we now live in a society that doesn't have that kind of literacy, but why not invest in the young ones now? David, and at the back.
So I love the emphasis on emotional literacy, and I really do wish that more of our society's leaders, including politicians, were emotionally literate, not just in the sense of knowing which buttons to press to get us to go along with whatever devious plans they've got, because some politicians are quite emotionally skilled in that sense, but more in the sense of being aware of other people's real emotions and their own emotions. But I worry that there are things in our politics which prevent people from being true to their own inner callings, and that includes the party system and the system of whips, that many times we don't have a full authentic discussion because people are whipped into saying, well, you know, you've signed up to this party, you have to follow this. So we don't get anything like the richness of discussion that would be possible even if people were more aware of their own emotional pools. Is this something we're stuck with, or can we just get people who are super emotionally illiterate who are able to transcend the difficulties of the party system?
Hi, I think my question is more around how do we get people who are disengaged with politics to emotionally care and be active, to not just to vote, but to actually register to vote, because I think a lot of the results of national elections and local elections are very much about, oh, the people voted for this, but actually there's never any focus, in my opinion, on how many people are actually registered to vote in the first place, and how little, particularly in local elections, when those are the issues that most people care about, what is happening in their own local communities.
Right. Can I ask you a question? Are you a member of a political party?
No,
Yeah.
no, and I wouldn't ever want to be honest,
Right.
because for me, it's about, I want to be an activist about what I care about, and if, for me, I vote, but to be honest, there's nothing for me to vote for. I don't vote because I really want to vote for any of the parties that are available for me, but I'm voting for the lesser evil, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you
Because
very
for me, it's a case of if you don't vote, there's not enough differentiation on the ballot paper to say why you're not voting.
Yeah.
Is it because you don't care, or is it because you're busy and you want to binge watch on your box set? Like, why aren't you voting?
Absolutely. So, how can we organise for more emotional literacy at the political level, and, you know, or should politics itself be a much more open space, not so defined by one or two parties or by left and right, or, you know, could it be a more open space for more expression coming from the grassroots? Okay.
Well, I think, take the first question first. The political parties were about the aggregation of opinion. They were about bringing together people with broadly shared worldviews to sit together, and it's kind of an efficiency, a managerial thing. It's outlived its usefulness. I think that's fairly clear, but partly because issues are more complex and no longer ideologically tethered in that way, but also because public can see that people are not thinking and feeling anymore. The old traditional idea that you would trust your MP to represent you and not merely be a delegate for your view, but actually apply their biopsychosocial spiritual selves to inquire into the best course of action with their fellow biopsychosocial spiritual colleagues and come to some kind of conclusion. The reason for that is that we've lost a key quality of public debate, which is what I'd characterize as disinterest. And that sounds like a negative word, but actually it just means to engage in a challenge or an issue without any vested interest in a particular outcome. And we don't really have that politically. Democracy needs disinterest. It needs that form of inquiry that's, how do I feel about this? How do I think about this? Not, I'm being told to do this and we have to get this message out because we have to win that marginal constituency there. So I think, how do you bring back disinterest into politics in a way that is emotionally intelligent is kind of the nub of the question. And I think the answer there is something about space and time. It's about places a bit like this, but not in a 45-minute session, but in a more regular engagement. To be a civic participant is not to expect your answer to come in one meeting, but to keep going back as an ongoing political education so that you're actually engaged in the evolving discussion and allow that to change you over time. But you can only really do that if you're not wedded to an outcome, because that's what stops the traction from sort of happening. And then just briefly, I agree that I think there's a big sham. The whole idea of mandate and people voting for a manifesto, it's just bollocks, to use the term of art used earlier. We need it to tell the story of political legitimacy. But most people don't read the manifestos, and when they do, they don't necessarily vote on the basis of them. And yet we're told that the mandate is locked in because of that conceit. So
possibly, here we are at Future Fest, and we're thinking about the future, and maybe a lot of it will be automated, we'll have more time on our hands, and we'll have more time to talk. What do you think?
For as long as I've been alive, I remember people have been telling me that I'm going to have 2 months less work, and I'm going to have a robot doing this, that, and the other. I don't know. I do think democracy in this country, and I know we're very privileged compared to other countries, but I do think it's a sham. It was set up to enhance a privileged class system. And ironically, it's gone back, so it's even less representative than it was, say, 30 years ago. So, we've got under 10% MPs who are really working class. There's still very, very, very white, pale, posh schools. I mean, and increasingly, as we become more educated and more sophisticated as an electorate, we don't want that. I mean, we had a perfect opportunity. We've got Westminster falling down around our ears, so let it fall down, or turn it into Disneyland or something, and do what they did in Australia and build a really new place that actually does incorporate some of the ideas that Jonathan and Indra have been talking about, and I've been talking about. And Citizens UK, for example, to go back to it, they ask in their assemblies, what is it that you want? How will you make this happen? The London Living Wage and the Living Wage, it's entirely out of Citizens UK, and they've achieved an enormous amount. And that has a sort of chain reaction. Then, there is no system of whips, because actually it comes from the grassroots. So I do think there are, NEF, NEON, there are all sorts of signs, and I think we shouldn't all go away feeling terribly pessimistic, especially if England is losing. So we do have reasons to be cheerful. No, but I mean, I do think Michael Sheen in the Welsh Valleys is doing tremendous stuff, making people feel they have a sense of agency. And when you have a sense of agency, actually what's happening at Westminster will have to change. So it has to come from the bottom up.
Yeah, and I would say as well, we had a session this morning in which people were expressing a lot of desire but very little hope. But actually the trend is, isn't it, for results to go against hope, against pessimism or against, well, depends what you think of the results as, but certainly the people are having their voices heard more. I think we've got time for one more question, is that right? Yes, so if anybody would like to...
So I just wanted to take people back to about 1998, 1999, when I was a university student. And I remember at that particular point in time, I felt, were talking about British values and identity and multiculturalism and integration in a really exciting way. And then one thing happened, 9/11, and it felt we totally stopped talking. There was a silence, and 7/7 happened. And we went back into our own circles again. And I've been thinking about this for quite some time because obviously I'm trying to make sense of my own experience through those events as well, as are probably quite a lot of people, I think, living in this country. And also based on what's been happening in the last couple of years, which I agree with you, I think it was coming for a long time. And I guess my question is this. We've been talking about emotional literacy in the young people basically coming up, which is great. And we've talked about engaging people and actually, Citizens UK and how they're asking people about what is it that you want. My question is, to what extent do traumatic events like that silence us and open us up? And how do we get better at having conversations about those kind of events, which we know are not healthy for us to be silenced about?
I just wanted to ask about the examples that the two speakers have given so far were about national democracy or local grassroots activism. I'm not tremendously enthusiastic about the recent past in national democracy like the speakers, because my experiences have been absolutely dispiriting at the formal level.
Whenever you're, in some sense, coming together politically and trying to build a sort of healthier civic space, you're vulnerable to external shocks which reinforce older tribalisms. And how do you handle that? And it's an open question. I'm not sure of the answer, only that my wife being Indian, I feel it, and so just want to say that. The question about where the hope lies vis-a-vis national democracy and local democracy, coming back to what I said earlier about 3 levels of democracy, I think when we say local democracy, you often think of the town hall and you think of councillors, and the nuts and bolts of that could be quite difficult and tedious, I imagine. But the kinds of work that the Alternative do, which is something more about the level of abstraction just below that, it's like the people who don't know each other very well but share the same space and share the same sets of problems, often share the same dreams and want the same things, and I feel the music coming on. But that's the kind of where the hope lies. It's the conversations, it's the pre-political conversations that give rise to a new political culture in which the kinds of sort of incipient alienation that you can feel when you don't feel somehow fully part of the civic space, you can get beyond them, because if you share experience, you connect through shared experience, right? You don't connect through a list of shared attributes. You connect when you've been through something together. And part of our challenge politically is that we're not going through stuff at an experiential level together. And we need places and time to share that journey. So I would say the hope lies not so much at the nuts and bolts of local democracy or even national democracy, but the kind of pre-political culture-generating political enlivening that's happening that we need to ignite
But we also, I think on a very basic level, we also need to recognise that central government does not want local government to flourish. It's been decimated. And again, the only hope is, usually in this country, when people are pushed really right down, they start to fight back. And I'm hoping, certainly I live in London, in my borough, we've got some young people. Again, Corbyn has had a massive effect, a positive effect in that respect, because people have hope again. Hope is a very powerful emotion.
Yeah. So, and I'll just give my own
And the other question,
Yeah.
sorry to say that, and I think the very fact that we are gradually becoming educated, I think respect is a disaster. I think respect is actually causing toxic fumes right through society and destroying trust. But if you're in London, if you look around in London, people have conversations all the time. Again, it's what Jonathan was saying about, and Indra, about common shared experience. And, I wish I had better answers, but I don't.
So there is definitely, so we've been in the game of the alternative for a year and a half, and when we ask the question, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? I think we come to the same things that you two have come to, which is it has to start a little bit below the political level with a capital P and become a small p politics, which is more about relationship at the community level and how to create spaces for that to occur, because through friendship comes trust. Without trust, we can't really have a politics that works at any other level. So how do we do that trust building is really the question. And Citizens UK does a lot of that work. We're beginning to do that work in our laboratories, but there are also other places, many other places where community trust is being built. And some of them are sports clubs, and some of them are food clubs, and some are energy clubs, right? So look for them. This is the age of that kind of small p politics is beginning to emerge. Thank you very much, everyone. It was very good to talk to you. Thank you very much, Yvonne Roberts and Jonathan Rosen.